I would like to start by thanking Dr. Vetz. She is my mentor that we've been working on this project together, examining the role of standardized tests in developing treatment targets for children with speech and language disorders. So as a communication sciences and disorders major, my education has been preparing me to become a speech-language pathologist, and a speech-language pathologist, or SLP, treats individuals with communication impairments across the lifespan, so from infancy to the elderly population. And when treating children, SLPs commonly treat speech and language deficits, which I'll explain in greater detail next. Speech deficits involve the inability to correctly pronounce certain speech sounds or phonemes. So many of you have probably heard a child who can't say their R's, so they may say wed instead of read or woed instead of road. So while you can notice that these children do have some speech impairments, you can still understand most of what they're saying. However, a child may demonstrate phonological processes when he or she has errors on several speech sounds or phonemes. So some examples of a phonological process is a syllable structure process in which the child reduces a word to make it simpler, such as saying nana instead of banana. A child may also substitute certain phonemes, such as stopping, by saying T for C. So normally the S sound can continue as long as you have air supply for, but if you stop that sound, you would turn the S to a T. Similar to speech deficits, language deficits also present themselves differently among children, particularly in terms of which domains of language are affected. The main domains of language are morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. So morphology involves word parts and their meaning. So a child who has trouble with morphology would struggle with putting together word parts. So they may leave off a plural S or a past tense ED. Syntax involves the ability to put words together to form phrases or sentences. So a child with a syntax deficit may have very simple, short sentences, such as saying, it's snowing, I'm cold, instead of using a conjunction, such as and or because, and say, I'm cold because it's snowing. So those conjunctions make the sentence more complex. Lastly, pragmatics refers to language use in a social context. So a child with a pragmatics deficit may have trouble understanding humor or figurative language. So if you tell that child, it's raining cats and dogs, they may truly believe that's what's happening rather than understanding the underlying meaning behind that phrase. In order to determine whether or not a child has a speech or language disorder, SLPs use formal and informal assessment methods. So a formal assessment or an informal assessment method, as the name implied, is less objective than a formal assessment. So informal assessment methods may involve interviewing the parent or the teacher or observing the child within the classroom. In contrast, the formal assessments or standardized tests are administered systematically or the same way across all children. So I've brought an example of a standardized language test. This is the CELF, or the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals. So each child gets the same set of directions and the same pictures for each question. So for example, if I were the SLP, I would be on this side of the page and the child would be able to see the pictures, and then I have a test manual that tells me exactly what to read for each item. So for example, no matter which kid I was testing, I would say, point to, the girl has a big spotted black and white dog. And from there, the child would point to the correct picture and I would mark which answer they selected. In addition, each standardized test has a manual that has directions to administer the test and also tables that tell you how to convert the raw score, which is simply the number of questions the child got correct or incorrect, into the standard score, which tells you how the child performed compared to other children their age who are typically developing. And this standard score is commonly used by school systems to qualify children for services. So if you look at the number line here, most standardized tests have a mean or an average score of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So that just tells you how far below or above the mean the child is performing. So if a certain child earned a standard score of 70 and the school system had a cutoff of 1.5 standard deviations below the mean, that child would qualify for services based on that school system's cutoff. So this is an example of a standardized speech test, the Goldman Fisto test of articulation, and you can see the arrow indicates where to record the standard score, and to the left of that is the raw score, which gives you the standard score. This is the SELF, the test I showed you that is a standardized language test, and again you can see where the arrow indicates where to record the scaled or the standardized score. And I also want to point out that you can see there are several different rows of different subtests, and those are measuring the different domains of language or language skills that a child should demonstrate. In addition to providing a standard score, most standardized tests also provide an item analysis that is used to organize the child's errors so the SLP can make sense of what patterns of errors the child is having. So two commonly used standardized speech tests that have an item analysis are the Goldman Fisto and the CAP, or the Clinical Assessment of Articulation and Phonology. Articulation is just another name for speech. And then a commonly used language test, the SELF, that I showed you earlier, also has an item analysis. So here's an example of the CAP, a standardized speech test, and this is the item analysis. You can see for each word the child says, you would write the response down. So for example, up there in the middle, if the child was supposed to say mouse, but he said mout, that would be an example of stopping. So you would record, yes, the child demonstrated stopping for that particular item. If you go over to the right to the syllable structure processes that we talked about earlier, if the child was supposed to say computer, but they reduced it to pewter, you would indicate, yes, that child was demonstrating a phonological process. So you would do that for every word the child said, organize them, and then count up the number of times the child demonstrated that phonological process and translate that to the test manual. This is an example of a standardized speech test that has an item analysis. Similar to the CAP, it has the words that the child says, and then you can organize them depending on which type of error the child demonstrated. So these are two standardized language tests. The SELF on the left that we looked at does have an item analysis. You can see the item analysis for language tests are a little different than speech tests because they simply tell you which item corresponds with which language skill. So if a child missed items 8 and 9, which are kind of small, so I'll read them. Item 8 says, the girl is not painting. and 9 says the girl is not ready for school. So the item analysis tells you that those two questions are evaluating negation. So you would know if the child got those questions wrong, that they probably have a problem with negation. And when we use a standardized test item analysis, that's considered formally analyzing the child's errors. However, the TOLD is a standardized language test that does not have an item analysis. So if an SLP wanted to know what kind of errors the child was making, he or she would have to go back item by item and look at what the child missed. So for example, if the child missed number 11, they haven't finished eating, the SLP would know the child likely has trouble with negation. However, because that standardized test does not have an item analysis, we consider that informally analyzing the child's errors. Prior research has found that standardized tests are commonly used for diagnosing children with speech and language disorders, which also involves qualifying them for services and determining how severe the disorder is. So the lower their score, the more severe their impairment. However, little research has been done to identify how often SLPs are using standardized tests to develop treatment targets for children with speech and language disorders. So in light of these questions, one of the research questions we asked during the project was, how often do SLPs use standardized tests to develop treatment targets for children with speech and language disorders? And secondly, when using standardized tests for that purpose, how often are they informally and formally using the child's errors to develop treatment targets? To answer these questions, we distributed an online survey to 107 SLPs in the United States through ASHA listservs. ASHA is the professional organization for SLPs and audiologists. 32 of the 50 states were represented. The SLPs were all currently practicing in a wide range of settings. However, the majority of them were practicing in school systems. So for each survey, the SLPs answered a series of questions that referred to how they develop treatment targets for children, particularly a 3 to 7-year-old child with a speech or language impairment. So we asked questions about both formal and informal measures. However, for this study, we only analyzed the formal methods, such as a standardized test. SLPs answered all questions for language and then all questions for speech, and the order in which we asked those questions was counterbalanced across participants, which means half of the participants answered all questions about language first and then for speech, and then the other half answered all questions about speech first and then language. So again, the first research question asked, how often do SLPs use standardized tests to develop treatment targets? And most papers and presentations traditionally will present all the methods, all the results, and then the discussion. However, I'm going to do that for the first research question and then for the second. SLPs were asked both open and closed-ended questions to determine how often they use standardized tests to develop treatment targets. So the first question, we asked them in an open-ended format to simply report the top 5 most useful procedures they use for developing speech and language treatment targets. Because there were such a wide range of answers that SLPs could provide with an open-ended question, we needed to use a coding system to categorize those answers. So we used an existing coding system used in a previous study to code their answers into 3 categories. One for standardized language tests, standardized speech tests, and standardized tests that were unspecified. So here are just some examples of some of the responses SLPs gave for each category that was coded into one of the three. So sometimes they gave a specific name of a standardized test, such as the SELF or the Goldman Fisto, or they just used general terminology such as a standardized or formal assessment. So for the open-ended question for both speech and language, SLPs reported frequently using standardized tests to develop treatment targets. So in the following percentages I will present, we combined the unspecified and the specified standardized tests. So for developing language treatment targets, 32% of the SLPs reported standardized tests as the #1 most useful procedure for developing treatment targets, while 24% reported standardized tests as the second most useful procedure. For developing speech treatment targets, similarly, 44% of SLPs rank standardized tests as the #1 procedure they use, while 21% rated standardized tests as the second most useful procedure. It's also important to note, if you look at the total columns for both language and speech, almost every SLP reported using a standardized test as one of the top 5 procedures. So in other words, at some point in their treatment planning process, SLPs reported they're using a standardized test. To kind of check the consistency of SLP's answers, for the first research question, we also asked a close-ended question for both speech and language that asked how useful standardized tests were for developing treatment targets. So they had 3 options. They could respond that they almost always use a standardized test, that information from a standardized test is useful, but they could do without it, or that they just typically don't use them in the treatment planning process. Similar to the open-ended question, SLPs reported frequently using standardized tests for developing speech and language treatment targets. So you can see for language, 79% of the SLPs reported that they almost always use standardized tests, while 89% reported that they almost always use standardized tests for developing speech treatment targets. It's also important to note that none of the SLPs reported never using standardized tests. So again, at some point in their treatment planning process, SLPs are using standardized tests. So again, just to reiterate, the results of both the open and close-ended tests or questions revealed that SLPs are frequently using standardized speech and language tests to develop treatment targets. And as I said earlier, previous research has shown that SLPs are using standardized tests for the diagnosis process, but these results also indicate they are important for the treatment planning process as well. So it could be that the assessment and treatment planning processes are merging as far as standardized test use. So secondly, knowing that standardized tests are being used to help plan treatment, the manner in which they're used were also of interest. So referring back to the item analyses, we wondered how often are SLPs formally analyzing a child's errors using the item analysis or informally using the child's errors. To answer this question, we had SLPs use a slider scale from 0, never, to 100, always, to indicate how often they informally and formally analyze a child's errors. So for the informal analysis, we simply asked the same question for both speech and language. However, for the formal analysis question, we included examples of standardized tests that have an item analysis. So for the language question, we asked about the self, which I had showed you. And for the speech question, we asked about the Goldman, Fisto, and the CAP and how they use these test item analyses. When developing treatment targets and using standardized tests, SLPs reported that they do analyze the child's errors on the standardized test. Particularly, they're informally analyzing the child's errors. So the numbers in the box are the mean or the average rating that the SLPs gave each of these measures. So again, these are the mean scores just on a more visual scale. You can see that for all conditions, informal and formal, the SLPs are reporting that they frequently use standardized tests for analyzing the child's errors, both informally and formally. It's also interesting to compare the item analysis, again, those are the formal analysis, between the speech and language. SLPs reported using speech item analyses less frequently than language test item analyses. And again, talking about the difference between the speech and language item analyses, we noticed that the SLPs were less likely to use a standardized speech test item analysis rather than a standardized language test item analysis, which may be due to the additional time and effort that standardized speech test item analyses take. So if you remember, looking at the standardized speech test item analyses, you had to go through each item by item, to determine what phonological processes were present, which could take some time. And then with the language test, you simply just look, say, my child missed question 14, I can look right on the chart and know what skill that item is evaluating. So one limitation of the study was the sample size. We had 107 SLPs participate, but of course, the more numbers you can get in the sample size, the stronger the results. Additionally, most of the SLPs in the survey were working in a school system. And again, like we talked about, how many school systems have a certain cutoff for qualifying children for services that may have impacted the results. And lastly, because we conducted an online survey, there were fewer opportunities to ask follow-up questions. So if we saw a response that was really interesting, we didn't have the opportunity to have the SLP elaborate on that because they had finished the survey already. While the results of this survey certainly suggest that SLPs are frequently using standardized tests to develop speech and language treatment targets, some researchers have suggested that doing so is inappropriate because most standardized tests were designed for diagnosis purposes. So therefore, it seems there is a need for the development of a standardized speech and language test that can be validly used for both diagnosis and treatment planning, which could increase the efficiency in both of these processes. So working on this project has taught me to definitely use caution when using different assessment methods with a child. As a student learning to become an SLP, it has taught me that I should not rely on just one assessment method, but rather use multiple to make sure I'm getting a clear picture of the child's abilities. In particular, when using the item analyses because of the question of validity.
Thank you. Questions?
Hi, thanks for
Hi.
your talk.
Yeah.
So, knowing nothing about this, I have a very basic question. So you said that some experts say that maybe it's not a good idea to use the same test designed for diagnosis for treatment planning. So could you tell us a little bit about how treatment planning is different from diagnosis? And maybe more specifically, like, what would be an example of a kind of question that might be perfect for a test that would apply to treatment rather than to these diagnostic ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. Dr. Betts and I were talking about how the diagnosis and treatment planning processes are separate. So diagnosis simply determines if a child does have a disorder. It doesn't really hone in on exactly what the problem is. So if you say a child has a language disorder, you don't really know what areas that child is having trouble with. So treatment planning comes in when you determine exactly which areas that child is having problems with, because when you're giving treatment to a child, you're going to be with him or her, an hour plus a week, and you have to decide, what are we going to work on for all this time? How can we get their skill level up to where they should be with their peers? So again, with the school systems qualifying children for services, a lot of times that diagnostic process is just saying, yes, this child needs services. Whereas the treatment planning process is, what do we need to work on? Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
So I have several questions, and it probably stems from the same thing, that I'm just not familiar with this kind of treatment and diagnosis and stuff. So what are treatment goals, treatment targets in general? What are they, and then what are examples of some of those kind of targets and goals that are put into the planning?
Okay, I could go two directions. Would you want to know more about speech or language, or just doesn't
Just
matter?
in general, what are they? Because you seem to use them interchangeably in your talk. So kind of in general, what are they, and then some examples. Either way, whichever you're most familiar with.
Yeah. So in our modular clinic building, it looks kind of like a small brown short trailer. I participated in our clinic, in which we have people in the community come in and we give them treatment with supervision. So I worked with a 7-year-old child who could not say R. So his goal was to correctly articulate or pronounce R in a certain position of the word. So eventually we want them to say R in every position of the word, before, in the middle, and the end. And then we would choose like a percentage of accuracy. And then, so within treatment, I would have a set of stimulus words I would work on, and I would teach him how to position his articulators, so his teeth, his tongue, his lips, to make that R sound. And we just do repetition of training his muscles to correctly say those words. So that was just a child with one articulation error. So on the language side, language is not how we say things, it's what we're saying. So, and it can be spoken, written, sign language. Language could be considered more complex than speech for a lot of people. So a child with a language impairment, you may see like children with Down syndrome or autism. So for an autistic child, you may have the goal of taking turns with a communication partner. So within therapy, his goal may be to maintain eye contact with the SLP, or ask questions. So it's just incredibly diverse. But does that kind of help?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And then the other question I had, how often are speech deficits and language deficits connected? Do you have that occur on a regular basis, or is that something that they're just separate, independent deficits and disorders that they don't link together? Or?
Yeah. One thing I do really love about this field is how diverse it is. Not just in terms of the age of clients, but the disorders. So you could have a typically developing child who is incredibly bright and intelligent and does fine in school, but they just simply can't, articulate correctly. And that can start, especially as kids get older, if you can't say your R's right or any other speech sound, you're going to start to get made fun of. You're not going to want to raise your hand and talk in class. So you could have that child who, like I said, we're just practicing how to correctly say that word. Whereas you could have a child with intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, or Down syndrome, autism, who has, both speech and language, and just a host of deficits. So you can definitely see them co-occur. Yeah.
Thank you for that presentation. I'm wondering about if there are any implications with your research for the kids who might be sort of lost in that gap between the average score on a test of like 100 and then the 1.5 standard deviations where they can actually get assistance. What about a student or a child who they take the standardized test, they're below average, but they're not low enough to qualify for assistance? Are there any implications in your study or anything you've kind of studied here or would study in the future about how to help those kids whose parents might not be able to afford, independent treatment or anything like that?
Yeah, that is a huge issue, especially in the school system where someone tells you, and it depending on where you go, what area or county you're in, someone makes that decision that if a child is above the standard deviation, they're good, they don't need services. And again, insurance is a huge issue for qualifying children. So that definitely comes up where a child is kind of right on that bubble. And that's why I said one thing I've learned is the importance of using more than one assessment method, because you could have a child who you just look at this kid and listen to them and you're like, they need help, they need one-on-one intervention, and then for some crazy reason they score well enough not to qualify for services. So I don't know exactly what the school system would do, how much freedom they would give the SLP to go ahead and put that child on the caseload. But that definitely happens when you're dealing with a standardized test and predetermined cutoffs.
Because of time, I will just end it right here. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thanks.
I'll ask my question afterwards.
Okay.
Corey, if you are ready to load your PowerPoint, just make sure we get a picture of you, Kara, and
Okay.